Last week, we talked about when we go through changes physically and how we should see ourselves the way God sees us, fearfully and wonderfully made, unique and set apart. And this week, we're talking about sex. Yeah, that's right. And I know that it can be awkward for some of us, and there are different responses when it comes to the topic of sex. Some of you just want to hide. Some of us are excited. Some of us are immediately filled with shame and guilt. Some are curious, and some are just plain grossed out. And I think when it comes to talking about sex, we have different responses because we have different thoughts, opinions, and perspectives on sex and sexual activity. I'm gonna ask that wherever you are on the spectrum, don't tune out, stick with me. There's so much more to the conversation than you think. Since we're in church, most of you probably think the main point today is sex is bad and you shouldn't do it. But I want you to know that there is more to it. I want to start by saying thinking someone is good looking and having feelings towards them or about them are not bad things. In fact, sex isn't a bad thing. The truth is, God made sex and God made you. Yeah, the same God who created you so wonderfully did so with a plan for your sexuality. And sexuality is how we express and act on our feelings and thoughts. And God created it. But because God created it, He does have some expectations about how we should handle it. And I think for a lot of us, we have two stands on it. Sex is bad and sex is casual. It's everywhere in our culture, and the world tells us it's not that big a deal. And the problem with both of these viewpoints is that they're so extreme. So if God made us and has a plan for our sexuality, how should we think about sex? Where do we start? Well, Jesus, the guy who Christians believe is God, actually talked about sex. And He didn't just pick a random time to talk about it either. Jesus addressed the topic of sex in one of His most famous talks ever. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. In His sermon, Jesus basically challenged and changed what the people had been taught about almost everything. He showed them a new way to live. In one statement, He gave us a new way to view sex. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." Okay, so just like in our world today, back then there were a lot of different views about sex and sexuality. The people Jesus was talking to here knew what the Jewish religion had taught them. Do not commit adultery. And basically it means do not have sex with someone other than who you are married to. They also knew that the people around them in other cities and cultures treated sex differently. So they were confused, and Jesus wanted to make sure that they were clear about how to think on sex. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus used this phrase, looks at a woman lustfully, talking about the way we think about or view someone else in a sexual way. And this was probably surprising to hear for most. Back then, they viewed sex as one thing, a physical act. And honestly, it's the same way most of us view sex today. But Jesus wanted us to understand sex is more than just an action. It's about our minds too. It's about the way we act towards other people. Jesus wanted us to know the way we think about sex is just as important as the way we act on those thoughts. He was stressing the importance of valuing others when it comes to sex. See, back then, women had very little value in their culture and were considered objects. So for Jesus to talk about the way women were supposed to be treated and valued was really different. So people began to believe what Jesus was saying, but this wasn't just a statement about women. It was Jesus raising the bar for how all people are supposed to value all other people. Psalm 139 says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." This verse that we talked about last week is not just a me thing, it's an us thing. We are all fearfully and wonderfully made, and we need to treat each other that way. Because God made us all of us are valuable. So how do we do this? For starters, if you're looking at a person and only thinking about how they can fulfill your feelings, you're heading in the wrong direction. If you're acting in a way that doesn't value another person, then you need to take a minute and think about if you're living the way God made you to live. To help us, I want you to evaluate some things in your life by asking yourself a couple of questions. Number one, how can I view others with value? What can you change about the way you see others that shows them more value? What if you made an effort to notice something about someone's personality instead of something about them physically? Or give your life group leader or someone in your life permission to ask you some tough questions about the way you're viewing others that can be helpful to you as you walk through this. Number two, why should I view others with value? More than understanding how to value others, it's important to understand why we should value others. Every time you view someone else as an object rather than a person with value, you're damaging your ability to have the kind of relationship God wants you to have. And the good news is you can start fresh today. John 3:17 says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." If you are a believer in Jesus, there is nothing you have done that can separate you from God's love. So no matter what you may have done or thought about someone else, through Jesus, you have been forgiven. So what we need to do is let our past make us stronger and live for Jesus today. Remember, sex is about much more than just an action. It's about the way we view others too. And as Jesus reminded us, God made us all, so all of us are valuable.